Welcome back as we continue our lessons from the Old Testament. We are ready for the second part of the life of King David. We're going to be picking up right after the time when he went out, when he had the battle with Goliath, and God gave him that beautiful victory over Goliath that we talked about in the last lesson. We're going to discover two very opposing feelings that are beginning to develop and arise, and they become very, very defined. First of all, we're going to look at the love of Jonathan and the love of the people as it began to grow and develop for David. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1 to 4 says, After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan, Saul's son, became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and he gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. You see, Jonathan recognized David's call. Evidently, from the very beginning, by his action of taking off his tunic and giving him his sword, his bow, it would seem that he recognized from the very beginning that God had placed his mark upon David to be the king of Israel, not Jonathan. He was the son of Saul. He would have been next in line. But he recognized God had placed the call upon David. Not only Jonathan, but as we read the next verse 5 there, we see that whatever Saul gave David to do, God honored him and blessed him, and David did it with total success. And this pleased the people, but not just the people. It pleased all of Saul's officers as well. The army was pleased. Everybody was pleased, including Saul's son Jonathan. They loved him. And even as time goes on, we're going to look briefly ahead and then back up again to pick up with the other side of the story. But just to see the connection of this one, as Saul begins to turn against David, at first Jonathan has trouble believing that could be happening. And so David tells him, he says, Jonathan, I think your dad, he's recognized that God's put his call upon me and he's trying to kill me, trying to get me out of the road. Jonathan says, oh, surely not, David. Dad would tell me that. Gracious, he'd tell me if he's going to do something like that. Well, David said, well, the new moon festival's coming up, and normally I would always go and I would eat with your dad and with the rest of them, but let me not go this time. And the first day, uh, he may just think that I'm gone. Couldn't eat or something that day, and he may not say anything. But let's let it go on throughout the festival. And if he asks you where I'm at, then just tell him, well, David asked to go home and I gave him permission to go be with his family. If he says, oh, that's okay, then we'll know everything's okay. But if he gets upset, Jonathan, well, then we'll know we got a problem. We'll know that he's wanting to destroy me. But we won't be able to just come out and tell it. How can we do it? So they came up with a plan. When Jonathan knew for sure, could feel his father out, see what his reaction was, then he would come out to that area in the field, and there was a big rock, and David was going to hide behind it at that time, and he was going to wait for Jonathan to come. And when Jonathan came, he would have his bow and his arrow, and he'd shoot an arrow at a target, and he'd send a young man out to get it. And if everything was okay, then he'd tell the young man, hey, I think it's on this side of you. Come back a little bit, come on in, pick up the arrow and bring it to me. That'll mean it's okay, come on in. But if he says, I think the arrow's on beyond you, it's further out than that, then that'll mean you've got to get out of here. Dad's out to get you. So they carry their plan out. Jonathan goes to the festival and attends it the first night. Saul doesn't really say anything, just figures maybe David couldn't make it that night, wasn't feeling good, or, whatever the purpose might have been. Well, then as time goes by, he's still not there and his place is still empty. So he's asked Jonathan, he says, where's David at? Jonathan said, oh, David wanted to go home, be with his family. I gave him permission, go home, enjoy the festival with his family. Saul got mad enough, he threw a javelin at Jonathan. Okay, that pretty well solved it. Jonathan knew, and he, beyond the shadow of a doubt, needless to say, he left the festival. And when the time came, he went out to the field with the young man, shot the arrow, and the young man was chasing after the arrow. And he said, go it, it's on the other side. It's further, go and run hard and fast and get it and as fast as you can. Well, rather than going back in with the young man, he wanted to tell David goodbye. So he gave him the arrows, he gave him the bow, and said, I think I'm just going to stay out for a while and kind of relax for a little while. Why don't you go on back? So after the young man's gone, then he runs out to David and they run together and he hugs him and he explains to him, I'm so sorry. I'll support you. I'll back you, Dad. He was violently mad. Run, hide. And later, even at another time, Jonathan meets secretly with David outside, away from the army, while his father's with the army chasing after David. And he tells him in 1 Samuel 23, verse 16, Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh, and he helped him find strength in God. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. Wow. Jonathan totally accepted it, totally submitted, totally yielded. And we don't see any hint of jealousy or anything because he loved David even as himself and was willing to put him first. Well, we're going to back up a little bit, back to the time after the death of Goliath and begin to follow it from Saul's side. 1 Samuel 18, verse 8 and 9 says Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. You see, when they came back in off the field, the people met them and they were singing, Saul has slain his thousands, wow! And David his tens of thousands. Oh. Saul said, they're giving more honor to him than to me. What else could he have but the kingdom? He recognized, as God had prophesied through Samuel, God was preparing to transfer the kingdom to somebody else. And he's beginning to realize it's David. It says from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David, watching everything he did, looking for an opportunity to get rid of him. In fact, at least 15 separate times he attempted to kill or have David killed. Wow. Not once, not twice, at least 15 times, and he was never successful because, as Jonathan was to tell David during one of those times, God's got your back. He's watching over you. Yes, David was forced into hiding. Yes, it created separation even within Saul's family. Well, number one, Jonathan loved David. Look what it did, but in order to support David, Jonathan was forced to go into opposition of his own father. And Saul was so mad he threw the javelin at him that time, remember? Wow. Not only Jonathan, but Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. So Saul thought, I'm going to use it. Yeah, he really loved his daughter. I'm going to use her. So he said, well, David, if you go out and be a great warrior and do all these battles, then I'll let you marry Michal. Because he figured he'd get him out in war and get him killed. It didn't work because David was successful. God honored him at every step. And as a result, they got married. Michal ends up protecting David. David flees and gets away from Saul because of it. So Everywhere you look, Saul's life is literally disintegrating to the point, finally, that Saul is defeated in battle, but not just defeated. In that battle, he is killed along with Jonathan. In fact, almost all of Saul's family is obliterated. Not totally, but almost all of them, because of the fact that he rebelled. I can't help but wonder how different the story might have been if, even after Saul had messed up, even after he had rebelled and pride had got him into trouble, if he would have, when he recognized that God had put his hand on David, if he would have said, okay, God, Jonathan's accepted it. Jonathan loves him. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm going to help him. If he had brought David in and trained him and prepared him and handed it over to him, what I see from the life of David, David would have taken care of Saul. He would have taken care of Jonathan for sure. And he would have taken care of their entire family line. They could have been honored. But instead, Saul chose to fight against what he knew God was doing because it wasn't what he wanted. And it ended up not only killing him, but literally destroying his genealogy from that point on. Wow, what a shame. Meanwhile, as we watch David, we find that 1 Samuel 23, 1 and 2, he's not just cowering back out of the way, waiting for God to get Saul out of the road. No, he's out fighting Israel's enemies, the Philistines. He's putting his life on the line for the people whose king is trying to kill him. He's putting his life on the line for them. Why? Well, because they weren't Saul's people. They were God's people. And therefore, he was fighting for his family, his friends, his neighbors, for God's chosen ones. In fact, during this process, we find two different times when David spared Saul's life. 1 Samuel 24, 4 through 6, Saul's coming, his armies are coming. David and his men duck into a cave in order to hide and hope, let them get past so that they can then disappear again. But Saul, well, he feels the urge and has to use the restroom, so he goes into the cave to do it. It's pitch black in there. Didn't have flashlights in those days. And so when he relieves himself, at that time, David's close enough. His men say, hey, David, God's put him in your hands. You got to kill him now. Well, it sounded like good advice, really. David said, no. God's the one that made him king. It's not my place to remove him. I will honor God's choice, even though he's not acting like a king, and he's certainly not acting like God's man. I can't do that. And he went up and cut a piece of his garment off and kind of felt terrible. Saul finishes his job, goes out and is walking down, heading away. And David comes out and says, Saul, do you recognize this? You might want to look at the lower part of your clothing. He looks down. It's cut off. David said, God gave you into my hands, but I wasn't willing to kill God's anointed. I support you, Saul. Saul says, wow, you're a better man than I am. You would have thought that would have ended it, wouldn't you? No, it didn't for that moment. Saul continued and continued and continued trying to kill him. Another time they're out in the field. The army's asleep. David calls one of his trusted guys to go with him, and in the middle of the night, they walk quietly. Now, Saul would have been in the very middle of the camp because that would be the safe place. That's where the king would be. They walk through the whole camp. God puts the whole camp to sleep, including Saul, including his number one right-hand protector that's beside him. He walks right up to his head where his spear is down beside him, picks it up. His buddy with him says, hey, God's given him here. Put the spear in him. David said, I can't do that. Takes his spear, takes his water bottle. They walk back out, get clear out away from Saul. And then he calls out and says, hey, Saul, Saul. Saul wakes up. That sounds like the voice of David. What in the world? David says, yeah, you might want to look around. You might notice your spear and your water are gone. I got them. I could have killed you. Well, again, David protected Saul at this time. We find 1 Samuel 30, verse 26. He's fighting the Amalekites, more enemies of Israel. And finally, when Saul was killed in battle, for 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11 to 27, he doesn't go around saying, ha ha, got his just dues. No. You know what he does? He begins to cry and weep. In fact, the man that was boasting that he had killed Saul, thinking that he'd get extra brownie points from David, David says, take him out and slay him. He killed God's anointed. Wow. David to the end. And then, even after all this and mourning Saul's death, and of course Jonathan's death, he asked, he says, is there any of Saul's family left? And they said, well, Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, he's still here, but he's lame, which in those days would have made him basically useless, because there was no way in those days for a lame person to overcome it. David says, bring him in. And I'm sure Mephibosheth was thinking, oh no, I'm in trouble now. David says, Mephibosheth, I loved your father, Jonathan, dearly, and I made a pledge to take care of his family. I'm going to give all of Saul's belongings, his possessions, everything he has to you. And I'm going to appoint this man here to serve you and to take care of all that. And by the way, I want you to come eat with me every day. That was the heart that David had. Yes, he did love Jonathan, but it was more than that. David was committed to the family of Saul in every way. The very one. We find that David as a king, he ruled for 40 years, 7 years and 6 months over Judah, and then additional, all of Israel came in under him for 33 years after that, making a total of 40. You think, well, David was a perfect man. He had it all right. No. No, David wasn't perfect. In fact, there's 2 times we find that he really messed up. One, the story of Bathsheba. He looks out the window, sees a beautiful woman bathing herself. Her husband's off at war. He has them bring her into him. He goes to bed with her. She becomes pregnant. This is not good. Rather than owning up and dealing with it, he sends notice out to the field to his commander. He says, send him in, let him come home and be here with his wife. And then I've got a message I want to get back to you, because he figures he'll go home, sleep with his wife, and nobody will know the difference. They'll just think it was his child. Well, he comes in, gives a message to David. David gives him the message to take back. And he says, wait till in the morning. And then I'll finish telling you everything I need to, and you can go back and tell Joab all that he needs to know. Figures he'll go home. He doesn't. He sleeps there by the door. David comes out the next morning and says, what are you doing here? You didn't go home with your wife. He said, King, the armies are out there. Their lives are on the line. There's no way I could go home, be with my wife, and enjoy being with my wife while the armies are at war. David says, oh, wow, that's pretty awesome. I'll tell you what, let's celebrate. I want to honor your faithfulness. He gets him drunk, because he figures, he gets drunk, he's going to go home. He's not going to be thinking. Guess what? He didn't go home even after that. So finally, then the next day, David sends him back, and he gives him a note to give to Joab. He says, give it to him. He didn't know what it contained, but the note said, when you go to war, the next battle, put him in the very front line in the most dangerous place you can, so that he'll be killed. That's what he did. And the man died. David then took Bathsheba and married her. Wow. Pretty terrible. Well, God dealt with him, and that child that was born died, and David repented and asked God for forgiveness. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But not only that, another time we find that David numbered all of Israel. He called them in, and he numbered them. Why? Well, because evidently he was thinking, look, I'm the king. Look, number one, you didn't do that unless God told you to do it. And number two, when you numbered Israel, you were to pay a ransom for every person that was numbered. David didn't do anything. So we gauge from that probably it was pride that was driving him. You say, well, what's different between him and Saul? Saul started out unknown. David started out unknown. Saul became king. David became king against all impossibilities. Saul was a mighty warrior. David was a mighty warrior. Saul was anointed by God. David was anointed by God. Saul fell to pride. David fell to pride. What's the difference? Well, David repented. We see no evidence that Saul ever repented. In fact, Psalm 51 is David's psalm of repentance. As he cries out to God and says, God, I've sinned. I've done wrong. Please, God, forgive me for all that I've done. And he lays himself out before God, and God forgave him and restored him. And all of God's promises are still in effect for David's descendants and are being fulfilled and will be fulfilled through Jesus Christ, who was, when he came to earth, in the line and the lineage of David. Wow. All of that. But it took a repentant heart. Again, had Saul repented, God could have forgiven him too. Tremendous lesson there. And I didn't want to totally walk over that lesson. It's so beautiful. But I do want to take a slightly different focus as we look at a message from this part of the life of David. And that message is the attitude you and I should have towards the leadership that God places over us. Yes, in the church, but more than just in the church, in our government, and all that are in authority. For instance, the first thing we find is needs to be submission. Romans 13, verse 1 to 5 says, everyone, did you notice that word? Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Does that mean that the authorities do what God tells them to do? No. But even Saul, David said, I cannot take my hand against God's anointed. Even after the Spirit of God had left Saul, even after Saul did all the evil, still David refused because God had placed him there. And David refused to go against the authority placed over him. Verse 2 picks up, says, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. Typically speaking, that's what should happen, but not always. It wasn't with David, but he still honored the authority. Even though the authority wasn't doing their part, David did his. Verse 4 says, for he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but because of conscience. That's what God has designed. Hebrews 13:17 says, obey your leaders. Submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. How wonderful when we have godly leaders and godly leadership. What a wonderful blessing. But nevertheless, authority is to be honored. The only time, biblically, we can turn against authority is when the authority turns against God and they move out from under God. Let's say God's here, I'm here, and the authority is right here in between. We are to obey, okay? Walk in obedience. Now then, if the authority walks over here, we remain under God. We must obey God first, yes. But as long as whatever they're asking is not contrary to God, we have a responsibility because of our conscience towards God to walk in obedience and do our best to serve God and trust Him. He knows how to remove them from authority or to do whatever has to be done, but it may not happen the way we expect. We are to be submissive. Why? Well, because God establishes and removes and establishes authority. We are to be supportive. Romans 13, verse 6 and 7 says, "This is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, well, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So give whatever's due. Yes, money. That includes our taxes. As a Christian, I'm not going to pay more than I have to, but I'm going to do the best to get somebody to help me to do it the best way that I can. But on the other hand, I am obligated to God to the best of my ability to pay what is due to the government to honor God because He is the ultimate authority. Oh, by the way, I've discovered that most people that won't obey the authority on earth usually don't obey the authority of God either. There's a message, a lesson that must be learned. We obey God always, no matter what, and that means we obey those that are under His authority as best as we possibly can. So that applies to the government, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God. Luke 20:25. But it also applies to the church. 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18. The elders that direct the affairs of the church they're worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, do not muzzle the ox whilst treading out the grain. The worker deserves his wages. The emphasis, the message. Give honor and just respect, revenue, whatever it may be, to whoever it deserves. Along with that, maybe we could throw in give credit to whom credit is due and honor to whom honor. So we're to show respect, we're to show honor in every way. As Christians, part of my message to the world around me is the way I act. Maybe it's on the job to my employer. Maybe it's to my mom or my dad or my husband, or respect and honor to my wife, or how do I treat those around me becomes an important message, because as a Christian we have an obligation before God to honor Him by honoring those. So we give just dues, but in addition to that, one of the most important things, prayer. 1 Timothy 2:1 and 2, I urge then, first of all, that request, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. We've gone through a time and are going through a time of the coronavirus. Some of the rulings that are handed down are absolutely necessary. Some of them, I'm not for sure. One person says yes, one person says no. But here's what I do know. Our government, they're trying to develop rules and regulations to help keep us safe. We may agree or disagree with them, but as a Christian, I need to be careful to walk under them in obedience and show honor and show respect. I have my right to perhaps say, well, I don't think that's really what's necessary, but that's what's required. So I'm going to walk in obedience, because ultimately I'm going to walk in obedience to God. Meanwhile, I'm going to keep my trust in God and my faith in God. You say, well, They make mistakes. Man makes mistakes. Yep. And Saul made some terrible mistakes. But David still lived in an honoring way all the way through, still fought the wars and the battles of the people. He still served, even though his life was in jeopardy. He even refused to attack Saul when many were saying, well, God's giving you the chance to do it, do it. Because he said, no, that's not the way God designs it. David recognized it. Yes, David made mistakes. Thankfully, he repented and he turned back, and God was able to honor that. And because of that honor, David not only became king, but his genealogy will continue through all eternity. God's blessings, his peaceful, quiet life can only result as we are, first of all, in obedience to him, and then we are in obedience to all those he places over us. I love the song, Trust and Obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, just to trust and to obey. Yes, first of all to God, but in that to those that have been placed in authority over us. Trust God. Walk in obedience. Trust God, and he'll take care of you. God bless you.